we do have the sense that some texts are deeper than others. And I don't think it's reasonable to disagree about that. You can read a shallow story. You think, well, that was shallow. And you can read a deep story and you think that was deep, but you don't know exactly what you mean by shallow or deep. So let me just add one footnote here, which is somewhat confounding. It goes to what we were just saying about psychedelics. It's possible for you to be bringing the depth to a text or to a circumstance or to a puddle in a parking lot that isn't necessarally there, right? So this is where it gets confusing. The postmodern quandary. Yeah, yes, exactly. I mean, literally, if you're going to connect all the dots, you can. I mean, this is something I did in The End of Faith as a parlor trick, just because I wanted to prove this point. Is that I literally walked into a bookstore and went to the cookbook aisle of the bookstore and randomly chose a cookbook and opened it up at random and just wrote down the recipe and then created a mystical text on the basis of that recipe. I mean, I just showed that this recipe, which it was for some Hawaiian cookbook, was like wok-seared fish and shrimp cakes or something. And I took the ingredients in that recipe and wove a completely confabulatory, mystical text out of those ingredients. Now, that was something I was bringing to the text. There was no author creating that document.
That's clearly a problem. And look, I actually,
and
when I
the
make
truth
my
is,
crack
people can always do that, right? So it's very hard to keep score here and to be rigorous. All we can do is again and again have this experience of you say something that on your own side purports to be meaningful and intends to be meaningful, and you're trying to convey something, and then I and other people seem to grasp what you're communicating, and we have this intersubjective convergence, which is increasingly satisfying. And yes, so I mean, but I do take your point that Dostoevsky was writing. The Brothers Karamazov is a deeply interesting, meaningful document.
Okay, so let's take that. Let's take that argument apart, because you put your finger on the postmodern quandary, right? Because the postmodernists, in some sense, the reason that they ran into trouble with assuming, they criticized the notion that there was a canonical interpretation of a text because there's so many subjective interpretations of any text. In fact, there's a near infinite number of potential subjective interpretations of any text, just like there's almost an infinite number of places you could be looking right now. And so it's a huge, deep problem. And when you say that you can project something onto the text that in some sense isn't there, that's also an extremely deep problem. And these problems are deep enough. The fact of multiple interpretations of a single reality is so pervasive that it stopped AI researchers. It's the thing that stopped AI researchers from being able to build functional robots. Like, it's a killer problem.
Yeah, it's a frame problem.
So that's the frame problem. Okay, so let's agree that exists. But we should also agree, and partly I think by the merits of your own argument, that we do have a reliable subjective intuition that texts differ in depth.
Yeah.
And that means something. So I'm going to propose what it means, and you tell me what you think about this, okay?
Sure.
So one of the ways that we specify where to look at is by looking at what we deem to be important. And so here's a way of conceptualizing that. And it sort of maps onto the idea of the fovea extending outward to less high-resolution consciousness. So I write a sentence because I want to write a paragraph. I write a paragraph because I want to sequence paragraphs into a book, a chapter. I write chapters to sequence them into a book. I write a book because I want to be a practicing scientist. I want to be a practicing scientist because I'm a good citizen. I want to be a good citizen hypothetically because I want to be a good person. And maybe I want to be a good person to avoid the hell that you described. Okay, so those are nested value structures. And we see the world through that structure simultaneously. The whole thing is there. And if one part of it collapses, we make reference to the part that contains it. That's how we don't crash like a computer. Now, the navigation that you described, these nested structures, they're navigation maps as far as I can tell. Now, okay, so here's the depth issue. Some maps have more other maps dependent on them than other maps do. Okay, so if I go into your map structure, some of that's even propositionalized, and I mess about with the deeper axiomatic propositions upon which many other propositions rest, then that's going to disturb you fundamentally. And that's part of that experience of depth. And look, you get much more, if you're married and you love your wife, you're much more upset if she divorces you than if you have an argument about who should do the dishes. Mm-hmm. Well, why? Well, because the stability of your marriage is a precondition for all sorts of other ways that you perceive the world. And if that's violated, well, that's traumatic.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm trying to get this clear with you is because you think clearly about these things, but also because it allows for clarification of language in some sense. So we could say that as you go deeper into that nested structure, what you approach becomes more and more sacred by definition. I'm trying to define it experientially because so let's say you're transformed at a fundamental level. That means something shifts way down deep. And that's how you feel it, even in an embodied sense. And what we've defined as human beings, as religious, as far as I can tell, or as sacred, is our attempt to define the landscape that is characterized by those deepest structures of maps. Now, what you're talking about, I think, is outside the map system altogether in some sense. It's the container for all of it.
Yeah, it is in some sense because, or it's orthogonal to it. I mean, it penetrates it at every point, but it's not reducible to it. And I mean, that's why it's so consequential. So, for instance, I think you can. Accepting your picture of nested maps and depth and all of that, I agree with all of that. And maps can be more or less useful and more or less in register with the reality they're purporting to describe, right? So you can have faulty maps. And in science, we really try to get an accurate map, and we have
a high resolution map.
Yeah, and we have a language game, which is, when it's working, is optimized to, as Richard Feynman famously said, not fooling ourselves, right? I mean, that's like the master value of not fooling yourself. Whereas I would argue in religious discourse, not fooling yourself is not a master value. And in fact, so much of what goes by the name of religious faith.
Okay, but let me press on terminology then, because you talk about the sacred.
Right.
And you accept that, and you also see it as revivifying and crucial to the prevention of suffering.
Yeah.
But you juxtapose that against religion. And so what's the difference as far as you're concerned between what's sacred and what's religious?
Good question. Well, so maybe the best way to get at it is by reference to a principle, which is, I think anything that's true, right? And this is true scientifically, descriptively, but it's true spiritually, and it's true with respect to anything we would call sacred. Anything that's true, anything that's real, is discoverable now, right? It's like a little like if we lost everything, if we lost all the books, if we lost all the tools, if we lost everything, and we just found ourselves having to reboot not only civilization but human cognition, everything that is real is discoverable from that starting point. Even if you're starting at zero again. Now we would talk about it differently. We would have we would have memories of what some of us would have memories of all that we'd lost, and that would anchor us to certain expectations. But the point is, what is true? What is real? What is the real opportunity for a direct, self-transcending engagement with reality? Right? What is the real opportunity for overcoming suffering?
Let me take exception to that in one manner. I see what you mean. I understand what you mean. I believe. But here's a potential problem with that. So,
first, I'm not saying. Let me just close the door to a possible misunderstanding. I'm not saying
that we shouldn't stand on the shoulders of giants. And I'm not saying tradition is useless. In fact, I would probably agree with you that we should be fairly conservative in how we overthrow our traditions. I mean, so I'm not arguing that we should just be radical iconoclasts we should tear everything down to the studs and start again. That's not what I'm advocating.
Okay, well, what's the difference in your vision then between the tradition that you would be conservative about and religion? I'm not trying to corner you. I'm just trying to see how you're making the distinction conceptually.
It comes down to very specific claims that I think are clearly false, and which many of our religions advertise as not only important but indispensable for their projects. So take Islam as a specific example. Islam, mainstream Islam, not just Al-Qaeda style Islam, just any Islam that really is worthy of the name in the year 2021, is founded on the claim that the Quran is the literal word of God. It is not to be.
The question is, what does literal mean?
Yeah, but in the minds of most Muslims, most of the time, it means that these stanzas were dictated to Muhammad in his cave by the archangel Gabriel, and he was commanded to recite, and he recited them. And what we have here is, in truth, the claim, the Orthodox claim is even more stringent than the seemingly analogous, fundamentalist, Christian claim about the Bible. It's not just that the text itself is verbatim what God said. It's that the document itself is, in fact, like every instantiation of the physical document is itself the Word of God. It's like there's sort of a double layer of sacredness to it.
Well,
it cannot
problem,
be edited.
Is the problem that claim, or is it the problem that the people who purport to understand it claim to be 100% right?
Well, no. But the problem is that given that claim, and given the actual contents of the book, what you have is an endless source of divisiveness and conflict. Like, if you dignify that claim, you say, okay, this is the most important series of utterances ever expressed on Earth. This is it. Let's find out what the creator of the universe wants us to know. What he wants us to know, above all else, is that, one, we should hate and fear and despise and resist and never befriend unbelievers. Right? That message comes through on virtually every page. And a hell has been prepared for these unbelievers, where their skins will be endlessly burned off of them and replenished so that they can be tortured anew, right?
Do you think there's any relationship between that claim and your observation that failure to take refuge in the sacred as you've laid it out dooms you to possession by the default network and puts you into that hell?
Yes. Okay. So it is possible to give a very enlightened reading of this text, or really any text, that allows you to step out of its divisive and toxic implications. So I would support that kind of reading. If we were joined in this conversation by Muslim scholars who said, no, don't you understand? Jordan's spiritual interpretation of this admonishment is precisely what God intended. He intended it to be an engine not of hate and division and sectarian tribalism. He intended it to be a device that would allow you to recognize the emotional and cognitive implications of being caught by dualism, say, right? Like, really, et cetera, et cetera. You go as far as you want in that direction. That'd be great. The problem is the book itself gives no indication that your interpretation is the right one. In fact, it gives every indication that it's not, and that
I'm going to be
heterodox.
Speaking with a sequence of Muslim scholars.
Okay, good luck.
So
I wish you good luck there. Yeah.
Well, I'm praying for good luck, because it's a conversation that absolutely needs to be had.
Yeah,
clearly.
no, I would agree.
Sam, I would love to keep...
to close, finally close this chapter, I would just say that it's not that what you're doing with the book isn't possible. My concern is that these books tend to make that very difficult, and there are other more plausible and easier interpretations that require less hermeneutics, less cognitive bandwidth, less principles of charity, and less cosmopolitanism, and so therefore it's no accident that you wind up with something like the Islamic State if you take the Quran very, very seriously. And that's what worries me as we live in this world where it's increasingly easy for small numbers of people to screw up the whole project for millions of us, as technology, leverages the consequence of
that's why I've been focusing on development of the individual, because it is increasingly possible for individuals to do that. So we have to stop doing it.